You can start.
Can you start?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to this edition of Toyin Falola Interviews, Global Africa and Women and Slavery, a conversation with Toby Green. My name is Ana Lucia Araujo. I am a historian and a full professor at Historically Black Howard University, Washington, D.C. in the United States. And today, Africanist historian Toby Green is in conversation with 5 historians of global Africa and the African diaspora to discuss the connections of West Africa with Europe, the Americas, and Asia during the era of the Atlantic slave trade. We are grateful to panelists Hassoum Ceesay, Mariana Candido, José Lingna Nafafé, and Phylisia Chapdelaine, who responded to our invitation. And they will draw on Green's recent book, The Heretic of Cacheu, Struggles Over Life in a 17th century West African port. This is a book that was published in July with Alan Lane in the UK and is going to be out in the United States tomorrow with University of Chicago Press. Then these panelists are here to discuss global Africa, women and slavery, and the role of West African religions and Catholicism in these exchanges, and their importance to understand this long and painful history. Our distinguished panelists will consider the great variety of oral, material, and written archival sources to address the central role of women in West African and Atlantic economies as traders, wives, mothers, and enslaved workers. Let me now introduce then the panelists. Toby Green, the author of the book that we are drawing on today. He is a historian and professor of pre-colonial and Lusophone African history and culture at King's College London. He was elected Fellow of the British Academy in 2024. He published more than 10 books, which have been translated into 12 languages, including The Rise of the Transatlantic Slave Trade in Western Africa, and his book, A Fistful of Shells, West Africa from the Rise of the Slave Trade to the Age of Revolution of 2019, won the American Historical Association Jerry Bentley Prize and the British Academy Book Prize. Green has worked on curriculum change in the teaching of African history, both in the UK and also in West Africa. And he has been a member of the UK Government Models History Curriculum Advisory Group. Green's work has been funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the British Library, the European Union, and the Leverhulme Trust. In 2017, he was awarded the prestigious Philip Leverhulme Prize for History. And he is also one of the editors of the journal African Economic History, along with Professor Falola and Professor Candido, who are here with us today. His latest book is then The Heretic of Cacheu, Struggles Over Life in a 17th Century West African Port. Now, Hassoum Ceesay, he is a Gambian historian, curator, and cultural administrator committed to preserving and promoting Gambia's heritage. Ceesay was features editor and editorial writer for the Daily Observer, while serving as curator of the Gambia National Museum. Currently, he is the director of the National Center for Arts and Culture. He founded also the Copyright Collecting Society of the Gambia and spearheads projects to digitize historical records. Ceesay uses media to make history accessible, inspiring then public engagement with the nation's past, while also advocating for research and preservation. And he published several books, among them Gambian Women, an introductory history, and Gambian women profiles and historical notes, a geocritical representation of Banjul, 1816-2016. Now, our third panelist, Mariana Candido, who is a historian and Winship Distinguished Research Professor of History at Emory University. She is the author of Wealth, Land, and Property in Angola, A History of Dispossession, Slavery, and Inequality, published in 2022, which won the prestigious 2023 ASA Best Book Prize in Africanist Studies. And she has several other books, including An African Slave Import in the Atlantic World, Benguela and its Hinterland, that was published in 2013. Candido is one of the editors of African Economic History and also of the Encyclopedia of Slavery, Slave Trade, and the Diaspora in African History. Her work has been supported by several institutions, including the American Academy in Berlin and the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Now, our next speaker, José Lingna Nafafé, who is an associate professor at the University of Bristol in the UK. His scholarship spans the Black Atlantic abolitionist movement in the 17th century, the Lusophone African diaspora, African Portuguese and Brazilian histories, as well as the intersections of postcolonial theory and the Lusophone Atlantic. In 2016, he received a Leverhulme Research Fellowship for his project, Freedom in the Lusophone African Diaspora in the Atlantic. His 2022 monograph, Lourenço da Silva Mendonça and the Black Atlantic Abolitionist Movement in the 17th Century, won the African Studies Association UK's Best Scholarly Book Award in 2024. Now, our next panelist, Dr. Robin Chapdelaine. She is the Associate Director of the Center for African Studies at Stanford University. Her interdisciplinary research explores human trafficking, child slavery, also equity in higher education, and Black joy practices. Chapdelaine is the co-editor of the book, When Will the Joy Come? Black Women in the Ivory Tower in 2023. And she is the author of The Persistence of Slavery and Economic History of Child Trafficking in Nigeria. Her scholarship has appeared in the Journal of West African History, Radical Teacher, and the Bulletin of Ecumenical Theology. And she also served as the guest editor for the special issue, Retrospectives on Child Slavery in Africa in Genealogy. Chapdelaine is currently working on her next book that is titled Embrace Black Joy, How Empathetic Teaching Empowers All Students. Before I pass the word to the panelists, I would like to start with a provocation coming from Green's book. We are on page 61, and I will read a little bit. So, go to any market in Guinea-Bissau today and anywhere in West Africa, and you'll find that most of the traders doing business are women. It is women who dominate what economists call the informal economy, covering the ground with their goods laid out on red and white checked sacking or stacked up on wooden stands. They are trading the necessities of life: onions, tomatoes, batteries, mobile phones, magic stock, cubes, sandals, in a context where without refrigeration or a steady supply of money, most people must go to the market every day. It is the market women who sit in brightly printed dresses, awaiting their sales in the small amount of money, which is essential for them to supply their household needs. This is the money without which they cannot do. And so it is the women who keep the market going. Their menfolk may be very far distant, working in Europe and sending remittances back home, or trying to get there if they haven't made it across the Mediterranean already. They may be nearer by, working in Dakar or Banjul or Conakry, and still sending what money they can. If this is the pattern today, it is partly because this is what it has been for so many centuries, linked to economic patterns of extraction and debt, which are so old. Historical structures die hard once they are institutionalized in the system of distance absent men and of women controlling the local market. Is one of this that stretches right back to the 17th century in Guinea-Bissau. And I will stop here and pass then to our first speaker. And I think that the order that we established is that Hassoum is going to start. Welcome, Hassoum.
Thank you very much. Good evening, dear panelists. To my a good friend, Professor Toby Green, and to everybody joining us, Denja Abdullahi there, my other good friend. The River Gambia, I'm speaking from the Gambia region, is well noted for its role in the transatlantic slave trade, and also in the ways and means that women were part and parcel of this, trade. I want to start with the case of the Signaras, for example. They are well studied, the Signaras, these were, cultural brokers, women of power and substance, of timber and caliber, of economic might and social standing, who were the descendants of Euro-African relationships, and they became more than cultural brokers. They were also rich enough to have slaves. Okay, they kept slaves and also traded in slaves. There's a lot of literature on the role of the Signaras, if I can, call it the, disputed, role, of the Signaras in the transatlantic slave trade. And now there is this, Gambian lady also who has been given some, some scholarly attention. That is, Fenda Lawrence, Fenda Lawrence. She went to the United States. She was the widow of a British trader in the River Gambia. After the husband died, she escaped to the United States in the mid 18th century. She lived in Georgia, where she continued to trade in slaves. Okay, her story is just been given scholarly attention now, but I think also points to the conflicted role of women in transatlantic slave trade. Of course, Phyllis Whitley came from the Senegambia region. He was enslaved and later became a poet of note, who even received the scholarly attention of the American founding father, that's Thomas Jefferson. And now Phyllis Whitley went in as an enslaved person, but was able to rise above the persecutions of slavery and became a published poet. So when you talk about the River Gambia, you had all these stories of women who took very good advantage of the potential that the River Gambia offered in terms of trade, and also in terms of economic gain. But at the same time, the river became very well much noted for its role in the transatlantic slave trade. James Island, for example, was a major slave departure point, right in the River Gambia. In Roots by Alex Haley, next year it will be 50 years since the book came out, and Alex Haley's story about Kunta Kinte, women feature a lot, like Kunta Kinte's mother, Binta. There is a very, very graphic, portion at the beginning of the book, where the author Alex Haley was narrating or recreating the naming ceremony, the outdooring of Kunta Kinte after 8 days after he was born in 1750, and describing the role of Kunta's mother Binta the role of women in a traditional, rite of passage, like a naming ceremony. Of course, Binta, the mother of Kunta, didn't know that in less than 20 years later, her son her son, Kunta Kinte, will be, enslaved and then transported to America, via, James Island. Now, finally, I also want to bring attention, talking about the River Gambia and women and the slave trade and slavery. The account of in 1905, Richard Jobson, all of them in their accounts, said a lot about, women who live in the communities along the river, which, they were able to visit, like Mongo Park has, several, mentions, of coming across, slave couples, or being offered, female slaves, to buy. According to his account, of course, he refused to, to do so. Richard Jobson, who came earlier than Mongo Park, also, has, very, very, a good description, of the women in the communities, along the River Gambia, for their hard work, their sartorial elegance, and things like that. So when we talk about women, slavery, and global history, I think the River Gambia's, becomes an important center, an important, place where all these, elements, came together and has, resulted in a very, very, mixed, if not, conflictual, picture. Thank you.
Thank you, Ceesay. Now, Mariana.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone who is with us today. So thank you so much I want to start by thanking Professor Araujo for organizing this panel, and thanking Professor Green for writing this book and giving us a chance to be together discussing his work. So I want to start by saying that I'm not a specialist on West Africa. I am a specialist on West Central Africa, as Ana Lucia Araujo mentioned in the introduction. And my work focus in a region that is roughly Angola, the Republic of Congo, and the southern parts of Gabon. This is what is considered West Central Africa, but most of my work focuses on what is Angola. And this is the region that was the most affected by the transatlantic slave trade in terms of the duration of the transatlantic slave trade, but also the number of people enslaved. So when talking about women and global slavery, I think it's inevitable to remind everyone the importance that West Central Africa has as a place that lost the largest number of people to the transatlantic slave trade. The demographic data is available and reveals that roughly there are 3 concentrations regarding place and time when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade. One is that almost half of every single enslaved and exported person left from one of the West Central African ports, so places like Luanda, Benguela, and Cabinda, so 3 coastal areas that are on Angola, in the territory of Angola nowadays. Another concentration that we have is that Brazil received more than 4.8 million enslaved Africans, and that the 18th century was the height of the transatlantic slave trade. So if we understand these concentrations, we can understand the historiography as well, in the sense that most of the work on the transatlantic slave trade tend to focus on the 18th century, not in the 17th century, which is the book that we are going to discuss later today. As probably everyone knows, but I also think it's important to remind everyone, is that the transatlantic slave trade saw more young men and boys than women carried across the Americas. So it means that the majority of people who remain in the continent were women. Women represented 36% of the 12.5 million Africans transported to the New World, suggesting that African societies retain a large number of women. And there are different, scholars try to understand what was the motivation for that. Some argue that it has to do with the productive role of women. Others focus on the reproductive capacity, and then the social roles as well. But in certain moments, significant number of women were exported into the transatlantic slave trade. In her latest book, Humans in Shackles, Professor Araujo shows that women and girls, and I will emphasize the point about girls, we are talking about very young people, women and girls constituted half of all the captives exported from West Central Africa in the second quarter of the 17th century, which is exactly the period that Toby Green examines in his latest book, or is the time period where Cristina Pereira lived. What I hope people understand is that the slave trade and slavery were gender institutions, in a way that understanding how they operated and how they affect people were profoundly different to men and to women. And gender also influenced the demand and the supply of the transatlantic slave trade, as well as the tasks assigned to enslaved men and enslaved women in different contexts. And African societies are not excluded from these gender natures as well. So my work focus on social and economic history. I have written about slavery and the slave trade. And one thing that became clear while doing research is that women are everywhere. Most of my research has been on Angolan archives, Portuguese archives, and to a certain extent, Brazilian archives. But it always astonishes me how women show up in the records. And this was something that I did not expect to encounter based on my training. I always heard that it was very difficult to write about women. But since I was doing the research for my PhD, I came across women everywhere. And I think this is important to recognize that women are not invisible in the archives. So women are there. Historians have decided not to work on them for different reasons, or not being able to see them for different reasons. And Toby Green's work, in a way, is showing this. Women are there, and we have to tell these stories because they are important, but also because women were the majority of the population, in part due to all this demographic that I discussed before. The transatlantic slave trade removed young, productive men from society. So women had to address the gender imbalance. So I think this is important to understand, that even when historians are not necessarily looking for women, they come across records. And this was my experience. So I have written about my first book, I was trying to understand the demographic impact of the transatlantic slave trade on central Angola in the interior of what is Benguela. And it became very clear that I needed to address the gender imbalance, the sex imbalance that exists, but also how it alters family structures, it alters societies, it alters how people understand production. And then I keep finding women in different types of records. Women are present in Inquisition records, as Professor Green shows, but they are also in the more traditional traveler reports, but also in population data, censuses, nominal lists. Women are also in ecclesiastical data, so for people who work in regions that have long interaction with the Catholic Church, such as the region that I work on in Angola, Women are there baptizing their children, being forcibly baptized, or they are also getting married. So we find women in different types of records. Now, it is much easier to find information about slave traders than it is to find about enslaved women. And this is something that I hope we'll have a chance to discuss later on. So I want to finish by saying that in part because women are everywhere in the archives, or at least this was my experience doing research in Angola and in Portugal and in Brazil, I'm trying to put together now a book. I'm trying to finish a book now on the history of women in Angola for 1500 and 1880s. And for me, it's a great privilege to read Toby Green's book while I am trying to finish this book and thinking parallels and similarities that are happening in different parts of the African continent. One point that I think is very valuable of this chance to think together is to see what is unique to specific regions of the African continent and what are commonalities that we see happening in other places. And I think something that I would like to highlight is the fact is that Atlantic ports become women's spaces, and several scholars have already mentioned this. So this is not it's not my idea in any way, but I think we are seeing in this the data for this, but also the visibility of recognizing the importance of women, not only on economic roles, but also as social agents as well. I want to finish by thanking everyone for being part of this. It's also a chance to see 3 of the African economic history editors in the same place. And for once, we are not talking about manuscripts. So it's nice to be together and be talking about something else, about a published work and celebrating the work that all of us, in a way, engage with, and that chance to talk about it. So thank you so much for including me.
Thank you so much, Professor Candido. And now it's the turn of José Lingna Nafafé. Professor Nafafé, go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Araujo. And yeah, I would like to talk a little bit about some of the other role that perhaps is not talked about when we talk about women and slavery. I think very often we look at the bigger picture in terms of the suffering, which is often part of what the Atlantic slave trade is about. Women have suffered because when we talk about wars that were carried out in Africa, most of the people that were easily captured were children and women, as Professor Candido has just said. That is fundamental because then what we now can see in the Atlantic is that the Atlantic world is saturated by women statistically, and also young people who were not part of the war and so on. But I wanted to talk about the space that women occupied in the Atlantic world. That space was the domestic space. Of course, they were part of the plantation, but I think if we are going to find a little bit more about the role that they played in the Atlantic, we must look at them in the space of domestic space. Because these were the philosophy of African people that they took with them or carried with them were told. The knowledge of African people were told through these women in that particular space. What we come to know today about religion of the African influencing the Americas in particular come from this domestic space. It is women who were able to carry it, they carried that philosophy, they carried that culture with them that permeated the Americas and so on. The other thing also that I think is not often talked about when we talk about the role of women in the transatlantic slave trade, in particular in the Americas, is that because they occupied this space, the domestic space, They work with the enslaved owners. They cook for them, they look after the children, they do all the domestic work. They had the knowledge of what many men would not have had. They could hear secretly what the enslaved owners were talking about, the ideology, or if you like, the operation of how enslavement of the African were to take place, or what that might have been. Of course, record might not be very strongly bringing that into space to our knowledge, but we could imagine that reality being there very well known to these women and so on. They knew that secret, but also they had the space to resist within that particular space. But I will come back to that in a minute. The other thing I would like to talk about, which also comes through the research that I've been doing, which is on the Black Brotherhood. The Black Brotherhood is very much an organization set by the colonizers, in particular the Portuguese and the Spaniard, which meant that at the time, the enslaved were given space within the churches to operate as Christian, or if you like, enslaved converted to Christianity. But the role of women in this particular institution were very important because they were given space to trade. And most of that trade that was being done, some of the money recouped from their trade were sent back to the coffin of the Black Brotherhood. And that money was used to liberate other enslaved within the cosmopolitan space of Portugal, as well as in the Atlantic, be that in Brazil or in particular in Africa, where we have records, for example, in São Tomé and other places. So women occupy this space of liberators, but often it is not very much talked about. The other element also that is very well known is that women carry with them the double pain. The double pain I mean here is the double pain of being mothers. Mothers both in Africa, being uprooted from their family, which they may not have been able to see, but also because of their reproductive role that they had in the Atlantic world. They were producing children. Some of those children were not staying with them. So this is the double pain that very often when we talk about the trauma in the Atlantic, we often tend to not to remember that as a being fundamental. Not that men didn't have that, but I think the people who lived that experience, that suffered mainly, were women and so on. Fundamentally, it is something that I think we need to research more often in the space of the transatlantic slave trade. Finally, I would like to say that women also resisted slave trade. They resisted slave trade back home. I have here in mind the role of Kimpa Vita in Congo. Kimpa Vita was critical, not only about the role of the Portuguese in Congo, but also the role of the hierarchy in Congo, how they have left behind the culture, the tradition, the religion that protected the African people, and they followed Christianity. That Christianity is being seen by Kimpa Vita as a religion which is devoid of reality. In other words, the value which put forward the human being as a being fundamental for society is not being followed. So I think if we are to talk about transatlantic slave trade, it's fundamental that we remember that women were part of it. They suffered, they resisted, but they brought the knowledge that now saturated the Americas. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. It's so nice to be with all of you. I'm thankful to be here, and I am certainly thankful to have the opportunity to read Toby's new book. I find it as much fascinating as it is important. So the history of African women in slavery is foundational to the understanding of the making of the modern world. The term global Africa signals both a geography and a process. The ways Africa and Africans, especially women, shaped economic, spiritual, and intellectual worlds that stretch from Senegambia to Bahia, Luanda to Libsyn. Women's experiences of enslavement, freedom, and kinship reveal that slavery was not simply an economic system, but a social and moral order that reordered gendered power across empires. Historians such as Mariana Candido, Ana Lucia Araujo, José Nafafé, and Hassoum Ceesay have illuminated how African women were central to these transformations. Candido's work on Benguela demonstrates that women operated as key intermediaries in Atlantic commerce, navigating the porous boundaries between enslavement and power. Their participation in trade networks tied African interior economies to Atlantic markets, while their kinship strategies anchored local legitimacy. Araujo's analyses of memory and representation remind us that women's histories of bondage persist in the moral landscapes of the present, that the global legacies of slavery are sustained as much through remembrance and silence as through economic structures. Nafafé's study on Luso-African communities highlights the contradictions embedded in early modern Christianity and commerce, where women of mixed descent negotiated moral and economic authority in spaces that were simultaneously sacred and exploitative. And Ceesay's research on Senegambian women reveals how female traders, griots, and spiritual leaders complicated European conceptions of freedom, creating local moral economies that resisted the homogenizing logic of empire. Across these works, African women emerge not as peripheral figures, but as architects of global connectivity. Their labor, domestic, reproductive, agricultural, and commercial, sustain the circulations of goods, people, and ideas that define the Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds. Yet their autonomy was often recast as deviance, their knowledge as sorcery, their mobility as a moral threat. To study women in slavery in a global frame is therefore to interrogate the boundaries of power and to reimagine freedom, not as a singular European invention, but as a contested African practice. Global Africa invites us to see slavery's histories as profoundly gendered and deeply intertwined. The movement of women across coasts and continents was not only forced, but formative. In essence, it made the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chapdelaine. And now we are going to have Toby Green speaking a little bit on the book and also responding to the interventions.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. And I want to begin by thanking Professor Falola, Professor Araujo for organizing this event, and for all dear friends for participating. It's really already been fascinating for me, actually, thinking about the ways in which this conversation may evolve over the next hour and a half, and so and the many different interconnections and the importance of it. As Robin, you just said, you know, this is such a profoundly gendered history, and women's roles transforming this. And as José said, the many different parts, you know, the experiences, the many different facets of that is fundamental, I think, really to thinking about global Africa and about the history of enslavement. And I think already, you know, some of the things which have come to me thinking about the book, Hassoum, you know, you started with Signares. So Crispina Perez, so just to show people, you know, the book. So the book is about this woman, Crispina Perez. And it comes from an Inquisition trial. So a very rare document, a historical document for people who are listening who may not be historians. You know, this is a very, very rare document. There are very few trials of West African women which were made by the Inquisition, and this is you know, really an unusual document from the middle of the 17th century. It was a trial which began in 1665, and it was made because she was the most powerful trader in the settlement of Cacheu in today's Guinea-Bissau. And one of the things, thinking of what you said, Hassoum Ceesay, is that, you know, she was a Signara, she was a Nyara. She was one of the people you discussed at the beginning of your intervention. You know, she was a member of the elite trading class, we could say. So there's very much a class dimension to the record which exists. In fact, had she not been such a powerful person, no Inquisition trial would have been made of her. You know, the Inquisition would only make a trial in this situation, in a context where there were very few interventions by the Inquisition in Africa, but this was one of them, and it would only occur when somebody was an extremely powerful person. So this already tells us really quite a lot about what you said, Mariana Candido, Professor Candido, when you said, you know, the trading ports were run by women, and you know, this already tells us quite a lot about that context. And certainly, as you say, the records I looked at bear that out. But it's important to say that, so the book builds on the Inquisition trial, but it also builds on other records from the Inquisition, and some of those do not deal with elite women so much. So some of them are account books, in fact, which were made in the 1610s. And they have a list of all kinds of trading transactions taking place in Cacheu at that time. And many of them are women doing the stuff of making the town work. So they may be the baker. There's a baker. They are, you know, they're buying and selling. You know, they're working in laundry services. They're selling. They're running small shops. All kinds of different commercial activities. Linking back to Professor Araujo's introduction, the excerpt you read from the book, Ana Lucia, which kind of described that context. And so this is important, I think, you know, to provide the context for the book, which is one which does deal with the life history of an elite woman, not a member of the political class, so that's quite important in a way. You know, unlike, you know, oral histories which we have from West Africa and West Central Africa, which account the lives of ruling women and of queen mothers. You know, this is not somebody from that class, so that already makes it unusual. But it also, the records we have also talk of women who were living in all-female households, and running their own small businesses, and that makes it quite an unusual collection of materials, really. And one of the things which Professor Nafafé, you kindly wrote in your endorsement of the book was, you know, what that brings out, I think, is something which historians are not usually very good at, which is the kind of emotional world which underlies the economic processes of commerce. You know, historians usually, and you know, some of the people listening today may think, you know, historians we're good at dealing with the facts. We're not always so good at dealing with the emotional worlds which underlie that. But these documents reflect that, and as you said, José, you know, they bring out some of the things which underpin this history, which we know as human beings underpin this history, but which we don't so often, you know, find evidence for, which historians need to have to write about things. So, you know, lust, envy, bitterness, love, fear, anxiety, debt, you know, they're all there, and the ways in which they also help to shape and interact with these histories, and were produced, of course, by these histories. So as you said, DG Ceesay, you know, what emerges is, in a way, somewhat of a conflicted history, somewhat of, you know, a contested history, but at the same time one which is, I think, as everybody has said in different ways, is fundamental to understanding global Africa, to understanding historical transformations of this period and the place, you know, and the fundamental role which, you know, women and gender relationships had in that. And I'd finish, I think, by saying, you know, I think one of the important things which maybe we can discuss is the time frames. So, you know, both Professor Candido and Ceesay talk about materials in the 18th century which describe the intensification of enslavement and the increasing centrality of it in West Central Africa on the Gambia River. This book dealing with the 17th century, which also makes it quite unusual for historiography of global Africa and slavery, and that provides a different context where, you know, this was, as I say in the book, this was in fact the 1660s, 1670s, 1680s were key 20-year period in the history of Atlantic Western Africa, where the dynamic shifted from one in which and led to what became the industrialization of global slavery. And of course, that that has massive ramifications for the different kinds of histories and the transformation of societies, which we can discuss later. But so I thank everybody for your interventions already, and I'm looking forward to how the discussion continues. Thank you.
Anna, please let me get involved, because our partners watching in various countries, they're asking me to dilute the program, because many of them say they're not historians and they have been flooding me with email messages. So let me satisfy them. If you, and the way I will start is what we call the African diaspora, that if you are in Europe or you come to the US, you are going to find many Black populations, Brazil, Cuba. And the reason why you find these Black populations is tied to this topic of slavery. Blacks have moved to Europe and the Americas in waves. The first wave starting from the 16th to the 19th centuries, by this very trade we are talking about, enslaved people funneled across the Atlantic. Majority were taken from the area of Central Africa that Mariana spoke about, and the area of West Africa that Hassoum talked about. If you are from Cameroon or Nigeria, that Biafra area, about 2.2 million were taken. Towards the end, if you are Yoruba, because its station in Nigeria was saying I should explain it more, you find Yoruba people in Bahia, you find them in Cuba, where their religions and cultures have survived in terms of candomblé, Santeria, and many other things. So you now find a second wave of Black people during the colonial era, when Europeans were controlling Africa. And many people began to come to a place like the United States for education. Kwame Nkrumah went to Lincoln, and they established Pan-African movement with Du Bois. And then you have the President Obama generation, when his father came to the US to come to school. And you have my own generation following the decline of economy in Africa due to what is called structural adjustment, that as the economy declines, more Africans began to leave. But we established the Afro-Arab Summit some years ago, in which people do not talk about movements within Africa itself. Millions of people move within Africa itself. So if you see a Black person in Miami or in London or in Jamaica, don't homogenize them, because the movements are not the same. And you find contemporary conflicts in a place like the US, in which some people may say you are not Black enough, that you are Black, but you are not an African American. Or if you live in England, which I did before, you have Jamaicans, West Indies, who came as part of the process of building the rail system. So that is the context. So if you, for me to explain Toby Green's book to you, if you live near the sea, the Atlantic Ocean, North Atlantic, where Hassoum comes from, South Atlantic, you find port cities were created: Badagry, Lagos, Porto Novo. That's where the slaves were being taken. So specifically, with the book we are discussing, there are certain things that follow what I'm trying to discuss. That in this Guinea-Bissau, there was also a port city. In that port city, there were slave markets. And what the professor has done is to take one slave market during the 17th century in Guinea-Bissau, a town, as in his book, with the port city of Cacheu. And in that port city, the book looks at the organization of trade and focused on one woman called Crispina Perez, which is a Lusophone name if I do not pronounce it very well. So what the author did was to say, this woman was born around 1615, and she became a very, very powerful trader. Around 1665, she was arrested and taken to Lisbon. For those of you who are from Nigeria, you find, if you study the history of the Benin people and the Edo people, you find how some people went to Portugal from Benin. And if you look at the regalia of the king of Benin, it looks like a pope borrowing from the Portuguese costume, which they now use to redefine the costume of the famous Edo king. Why was this woman taken to Lisbon? Why? Because she was accused of performing what they call jabakos. I can't pronounce it very well, which is to use juju. That's what you will call it in Nigeria, which is a ritual. She was a ritual healer. She wasn't the only example, because if you study slavery in the Americas, you find slaves who had antidote to snakes. If you go to Bahia, even today, you find at the back of their houses medical gardens, planting herbs to cure a variety of diseases. So this woman was accused of what we will now call witchcraft. That's my own word. The author used a separate word, ritual practices. And now, first, which is going to answer for you, why was it an offense? Why was ritual healing an offense? The professor will explain that to you. How did he now come about this? Historians use what is called archives, which are kept. And as they use these archives, they use them to write. He found these archives in Portugal. It's very rare to find this kind of archive. And when he found it, it's one of the very first books to use a single cumulative source to write a book. And in writing this book, although it was focused on a woman that was taken to Lisbon, as the professor began to read those materials, he began to tell us about culture in the 16th century, about the clothes they were wearing, about their religious system, and about trade. And as you know, the panelists were talking about the role of women in trade, in commerce, and in so many things. So when through his data and through other sources, he now moved back to the area of Guinea-Bissau to tell us about the society there, about how they were conducting their religious practices, African traditional religion, and was also able to tell us about commerce. Inquisition was common, even among Europeans. Inquisition was there. You could see the Catholic Church engage in Inquisition. You can find early philosophers, Inquisition. When I was young, I read a book called The Joan of Arc, which was about Inquisition, how you accuse someone and you kill them because they committed heresy. In this case, why was he using herbal medicine? Why was the woman using juju? Was she a witch? And between 1665 and 1668, she was convicted, very usual, because it's the evidence against her, and it's very difficult to argue. And then she was asked to repent, which she did, and then she was taken back home. and she died in 1670. Why are we as scholars discussing this book? As one of you asked me, you call and say, why are we discussing it? I will tell you why we are discussing it. We are discussing it to emphasize the role of women. In classrooms, we call that agency. Agency means how do people empower themselves, or how are they empowered? And Green tells us in this book that you can't just say African women as folding their arms, being controlled, but that they were also far more than being victims. They were not victims. They were traders making money. They were political and social leaders. They were asking as brokers. And in the case he began to tell us about diplomacy and about trade. The book also tells us that there was not one dominant religion, contrary to what people think, that you can't just say the Catholic dominated that area. That in various ways, Professor Green showed us that there were African religious practices, beliefs in dreams, beliefs in spirits, beliefs in rituals. And we must see it as part of world history, part of world trade. When the professor is talking about connections between Portugal and Africa, connection between Africa and the world, connection between the Atlantic world and Indian Ocean, so that we find a history of the globe. And it's also about conflicts, a lot of fights, about envy, who was famous, who was rich, and about power. Even it's an historian's delight in terms of the use of archives. Some of you are used to long durée history. Some of you are used to macro history. We call this a micro history, whereby you take one case and you analyze that one case and you use that one case to explain bigger issues and bigger events. It's a rich book based on archives. One of you asked me, did he interview the woman and women during that generation? That was a long time ago. You can't get people to interview. But in spite of that, I will call it a very ambitious book based on one trial. Of course, it's limited by what the archives can let him do. So you are going to ask questions that he may not be able to answer, because he cannot answer all the questions because the evidence is there. So let me round up. For the people in Cameroon, they say, why should they read the book? Why should you buy the book? Well, call it our understanding of the Atlantic world. The world united by the sea, from Houston to Lagos, wherever you find the sea, in which the sea is a unit of history. We call it Atlantic history, and call it our understanding of women and commerce. One of the speakers, the moderator started by quoting a passage in the book that market structure is still being dominated by women, and that it's always been there. I know that some of you asking us these questions, you have seen that kind of market before. And it's about how religions can combine. What the jargon we use in the literature is hybridity. The language we use is hybridity. I hope those of you who are not historians and who want to understand this better, I hope I've been able to break the books to you in these pieces. And I hope I've not misrepresented the author, because I'm trying to break it down from my own reading of the book. Toby, if I've misrepresented you, this is the time to say, this is Falola has misrepresented you. Sorry,
No.
I have to do. Sorry for this interruption, but they kept asking me to break down the book.
Actually, Prof, I am extremely grateful. You have broken it down much better than I did. So I thank you. I think you really have summarized it very perfectly. So thank you.
So my boss, you can now take over.
So thank you so much, Professor Falola. It was really a very nice overview of the book in a way that can attract attention from anyone. So now we have the panelists back. Then we can perhaps start with Professor Candido, then Professor Nafafé, Professor Chapdelaine, then Professor Ceesay, and then back to the audience, or if Toby wants to answer some questions or comments. Go ahead.
Thank you. And I think it's a nice transition to what I had planned to discuss today. Why should anyone read this book? Well, you should read this book for different reasons. Perhaps the most important one for me is that it's an accessible book. It's easy to read, so it's not an academic. It is an academic book, but it doesn't have the academic lingo. You can read. It's a very difficult story, so I don't want to, in a way, portray the idea that it's a light reading. No, it is a narrative about a terrible event, but it's done in a beautiful way, in an accessible way, that people who might not be familiar with Cacheu will learn about this place. It is also important because it moves away from the concentration that we have in African history. We have lots of scholarship about certain places of the African continent. One of them is Nigeria, for obvious reason. So this is a book that does not focus on Nigeria, but it does make lots of connections that will be familiar to someone who knows about Nigerian history, or someone. You can see connections to other places. So I would say, if you want to read a book about a different part of the continent and you want to understand connections, this is a book to read. I also think it's an important book to read because, unlike previous scholarship about individual cases, and there has been in recent years lots of attention to individual cases of enslaved men or enslaved Africans, let me put it this way, forcibly removed from the continent during the era of the transatlantic slave trade. This is a book that focuses on women. Most of the scholarship has been done focusing on men. So it's something different. It doesn't mean that men are not part of the story. It focuses on the case of a woman, but to understand these women, what Toby Green does is that it shows how powerful women and not so powerful women related to the rest of the society. So no one lived in isolation. It's also a book that expands what we know about African port towns. And it shows that African societies were not isolated. This is not new in Toby Green's work. He has been doing this for several decades, but I think it's something that becomes more, it's easier to access in this latest book, in Cacheu's book, because you can see how people living in Cacheu were not excluded from events happening in other parts of the Atlantic. So I want to go back to Professor Falola's point in showing that the Atlantic is a space of movement, not only of people who are forcibly transported, but also of ideas, of fashion, of material culture. There are lots of things happening at the same time. And in this book, Professor Green shows how the 17th century is an important moment to start understanding this transformation that profoundly affects African society. and African societies living along the coast, but also people living far away from the coast. People living in the interior were also profoundly affected by the changes that took place in the 17th century. So I would say it's an important book to read, even if you are not familiar with Cacheu, if you're not familiar with Portuguese language. Most of the records were produced by Portuguese-speaking people, but it's an accessible text. And I also think there is something very important in this book, and I would like to hear more about from Professor Green later on. It is a book that forces us, including us teaching African history, to stop and think on how we teach African history. So much has been written in the 1970s, in the 1980s about the lack of records, the lack of historical evidence to write the history of Africa. And historians then have started engaging and taking seriously oral tradition. So we see this push to focus on orality, recording oral traditions, transcribing these oral traditions to build the history of Africa, of African states and so on. And I do understand why it happened in the context. But what I think it's important in Cacheu is that it shows that by neglecting, or that the focus of so much on oral traditions has led historians to neglect written records about the continent. And
somebody from University of Unsqua said, how is it different from Ekwano's book?
Oh, how is it different from Ekwano? Well, this was not done by so Cristina Pérez did not write it. So it is it's a criminal record against her. She's accused, as you mentioned before, she was accused of engaging in so-called witchcraft. But in the process, what becomes clear in Toby Green's book is that she was a healer, she was a powerful woman, so she was accused of engaging in an illegal practice as a way of deal with internal competitions about people. But it's not a document created. She did not write this document, for example. So it's not a narrative written in the first person. So it's the work of historian to try to navigate and get the information there. And Professor Green can correct me if I have misrepresented. The other points that I want to focus is that it is, and this is a point that Professor Falola mentioned before, it is a micro history. We tend to focus on big history, big events. And this is a case that takes one single life as a way to understand what was happening in the society. So it is a micro history in the sense that Green focused on the life of these women. But the readers learned on the way a lot about Cacheu, on how Cacheu is inserted in different economic trade networks, on the different people who are living and going. We learn a lot about religious beliefs. So it's also a way to understand better, using a life story to understand better what was happening in this society. And I want to emphasize the point that we know much more about individual cases of men in African history than we know about women. Women are the majority of the population in the African continent, and we know so little about the experience of women in the African past. This is important for African history, but also for the African diaspora. Women living outside of the African continent need to understand that it's difficult to generalize, and this is the danger. It's difficult to generalize, but we see this glimpse of women who enjoy lots of power in specific moments. And because they enjoy economic power or political power, they were seen as a threat. As
from the University of Calabar. Somebody said, was she raped?
I don't want to answer
Toby,
about,
no,
I don't want to answer about the book because I'm not the author. So maybe I should stop my comments here on why you should read the book.
Toby, somebody was asking you, University of Calabar, was she raped?
Thanks for the question. Thank you, Prof. Toyin. Not as far as we know.
It's not my question.
Yeah, no, I understand. Not as far as we know. There's no evidence of that in the trial. She was actually, as I say, the most powerful woman in the town. So, and an interesting aspect of this, in terms of gender relations, which is quite interesting. In patriarchal societies, men often marry younger women, and when they marry, the woman often moves to the man's household. Not always, but often. And in fact, in Cacheu, the evidence is it was the reverse. So her husband was younger than her, and when they married, he moved into her house. So the suggestion is, from coming back to what you said, Mariana, earlier, that women ran the town, and that also involved sexual relationships as well. So there doesn't seem to be much evidence of that, and that she was raped, certainly.
Okay, Ana, please.
Okay, now I can unmute myself. I just want to, before passing to José, just to add something regarding the difference with Equiano. First of all these narratives that we have, like the one by Equiano, were written by men, then of those who were born in Africa. Then for those, if you want to read the narratives of formerly enslaved people in the United States, we have several of them written by women. But by those who were born in the African continent, we do not have. Those who experienced the Middle Passage and left these narratives, they are usually men. We have a very short narrative, and perhaps in the future we are going to find by women, but mostly are written by men. And in this case, she didn't write this her own story, but we have access to what she thought and about her life, because people were interrogated by the inquisitors. So we have the questions, and then we have the answers. Of course, it is a scribe who who translated and wrote down the answers. But still, we have access to her voice. So now, José, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Professor Araujo. I think if we can say anything about Toby's book, it is very important that locating the book in the 17th century, what had happened then, most of that is not different, if we were to think about it closely, to what we do today. African or Africa then and Africa now continue to resist certain ideas, certain ideologies that come to Africa. For Perez, practices of religion, which I think the book has talked about in her life, what is the basis for her understanding her world was the practice of African religion. Christianity came to that space, and it needed to negotiate that knowledge, that understanding within the space where she lived in Cacheu. So this is the struggle. In other words, her world was not, in other words, antagonistic to Christianity. She could borrow easily the practice of Christianity, but also kept her own practice, which was African practices. To trade in Africa in the 17th century, even now for many, you have to consult what we call the world of the ancestors. Your secrecy of your success is based on that. But Christianity put a cap on practices. Once you are Christian, you can't move beyond that. Your practices is limited. That is what Cristina Perez was revolting against. In other words, what the world outside saw as a being contradictory. But for her, this two world was not. Rather, they were complementary in her success, in her trade, in the world that she lived in. So in Guinea-Bissau today, we still have the practice of Jambakus. Anybody who is sick, you go and consult the seers. They will tell you what is going on, or they might guide you what to do. That's what Perez was doing. So the fears, our world of not knowing the future or knowing the present now, who are your enemies, what to do with them, was that world of 17th century, still is the world of 20th century, 21st century in Guinea-Bissau today. That practice hasn't gone away. But Christianity says, no, you got to get rid of that and bring in something completely new, which is Christianity, which doesn't deal with the detail of how you deal with your reality in terms of daily experiences that Perez was going through at the time. I think what Toby has done here is to show us that it is rare to find the writing of women who have shown how the practice of their own in terms of understanding their culture can deal with the new culture that come into the space, in this case, Christianity. We have very few. One example I could think about in Brazil, which again, not many books have been written about her, is Rosa Egyptiaca. Rosa Egyptiaca, from the understanding, was born in Africa as a young woman, as a young girl, was taken to Brazil, and then from there on, she was involved in the world of Christianity, used as a prostitute, and later on, she was accused, taken to Portugal by the Inquisition tribunal to be judged, and she died there. So we have a writing, but that writing is still very much at the moment being disseminated. So what Toby has done here is to enter into the world of Cristina Perez and trying to bring that world back to our reality to help us to rethink what might have happened then and how that world is not that different from our world today. Most of the things that we still think about today, the space of women and all of that, religion and the African practices is still there. And they also are what we know today in our modern time. I think
so from South Africa, Jose, somebody is saying compare her with Sarah Beckman.
Right. I don't know. I mean, it is a very good comparison. It is a very good comparison. Yes, Sarah Beckman came to Europe and so on. She resisted, but also we find, the views that came to her in Europe and all of that kind of stuff. Yes, I think you can make a comparison here, but she was brought in, Sarah Beckman was brought into Europe as an entertainer, which I think is different from Cristina Perez. Cristina Perez was brought in as somebody who was not behaving very well in terms of religious practices. In other words, the Inquisition wanted to correct her behavior, whereas Sarah Beckman was, do whatever you can to entertain people at the time. Yes, they all came to Europe, but what they represented, part of African culture is there, but I think the two are slightly different in terms of what they're
So Mariana from Mozambique, can this panel constitute a judicial, I'm translating, very difficult for me. Can you all become a judicial panel to sue Portugal?
Well, we are historians, so I wish we had this power to sue states. I wish we were this powerful and people care and politicians care about our opinion on that way. But I think this type of research and this type of books show that we need to have serious conversations about the impact of the transatlantic slave trade on African societies, on the people who remain on the continent. So much of the attention has been to what happened to the people removed from the continent. And in this book, we understand how the transatlantic slave trade affected people who remain in Africa. And most of the people who are free So in a way, people who are engaging in the slave trade, selling human beings, and yet they were profoundly affected by the violence of the transatlantic slave trade. So in a way, it complicates these narratives about, for example, African participation on the slave trade, that it tends to happen a lot in Europe nowadays, in saying, oh, Africans participated in the slave trade. And what Toby Green is showing here is that even slave traders had a hard time maintaining their position in the long term.
Yeah, could I say something a little bit about that? Am I still on, or have I muted myself?
Ana is the moderator. I'm not the moderator. But
we can hear you. We can hear you, José. We can hear you,
people who are watching on TV, we must answer them immediately.
Okay, perfect. José, you can reply, and then we are going to have then Hassoum and then Robin.
Yeah, I think answering that question, whether there's evidence or whether the panel can sue Portugal. Personally, we can't do it, but we can do it in conjunction with the others. There are movements around the world today that are talking about reparation. I think the panel joining that movement would help to contribute to the form of what reparation might look like. Because what we see here is telling us how the intervention of illegality into a practice which was considered for the African normal, it became illegal in that sense. The legality is determined somewhere, not in Cacheu, not by the Jambacos, but it's determined by other people. I think Christina being carried to Europe show clearly that religion in the African practice, in the African understanding, you don't persecute somebody else because they have a different belief. That is not how African would behave in their practices. Unless you kill somebody, perhaps, then you can be brought into a question. But what we're seeing here is intervention of illegality. And that also can be part of what we call reparation. Reparation can move into different forms in terms of healing, in terms of religious practices, and all the other big things, as Professor Candido said. These idea that the African were involved in the slave trade, making slave trade as if it was African, is becoming very questionable. So I'll stop here, Professor Araujo. You can pass it on to somebody.
I mean, Professor Araujo, I know I'm supposed to wait to the end, but this is such an important question. Am I allowed to intervene? I am. Thank you. I just want to add that one of the I think important things of the book in terms of questions of reparations is the showing of, for example, many of the things which are associated with the Americas. Maroon communities, people forming fugitive communities in Brazil, in Jamaica, in other parts of the Americas, is happening in West Africa. So there's Maroon communities in what's today Casamance, the southern part of Senegal, near to Cacheu. There are the rulers of that area are welcoming people who managed to escape from enslavement in Cacheu. So we that's one example. There are other examples of peoples who are attacking Portuguese ships and killing the crew and fighting strongly. And I've shown this in some of my previous work. In fact, in my 2012 book, which Ana Lucia mentioned, that's discussed quite a lot. So it shows really that, as has been said, it very much shows a different facet to what is traditionally discussed in Western histories of this topic of Africa, which of course itself is a massive generalization at this time.
Thank you. And now we can have, I don't know.
The University of Gambia, they have a question for Hassoum. How is this woman different from Jammeh?
Can you repeat, please?
How is this woman different from Jammeh, the former president of Gambia?
Oh, well, I think the context was quite different. And I think Christina also was like more cosmopolitan, more, world-wise, than Jammeh. It's going to be a tall stretch, a very long stretch to, want to compare a lady of the 17th century to an African, potentate of the, 21st century, indeed.
So, Hassoum, if you want to continue a little bit more, or you can move to Robin, and then perhaps we can open for the floor for questions. I don't know if you have any more remarks.
Well, yes, yes, I
go
really
ahead,
have
please.
some.
Okay, go ahead.
Much. I want to comment on the sources, the records of the Inquisition, which I find very fascinating, if not very innovative. And Prof, thank you very much, for breaking new ground here. I think the strength of the Inquisition records is that you have the plaintiff's voice. You have the voice of the of the jury. You have the voice of the judge. You have the voice of the witnesses. You have the voice of the prosecutor. So really, it is not like a monologue. Unlike many other sources, somebody asked about Alada Aquino, and like Professor said, not in the first, I, so I think that is a strength of this source, that you have several, if not many, voices, in those records, so I think that is one. Now, number two has to do with the orality. I manage the oral archives here in the Gambia, and Professor Toby is our good friend and collaborator. In the book, you have a lot of, fantastic, words or sentences or ideas that we want to equate with or the jelly or the gebel in West Africa. There's a portion where Christina is talking, where one of the witnesses is talking about people turning into elephants, turning into hippos. This is fantastic, and it's exactly what the West African griot, the gebel, will say. We remember, so Jibril Tamsirian's, work on Sunjata, So there is that, orality also in the book. The exaggeration, the simile, the anecdotes that here in West Africa we want to link with the griot, the orality of the griot. And now another point has to do with the microhistory. Now the book gives agency to Christina Perez, yes, but surprisingly also, to Cacheu, to the town. Last year in 2024 in June, I was going to Guinea-Bissau, by road. I spent a few hours at Cacheu. Now, if you see the Cacheu in the book, very cosmopolitan, busy. A hub. Everybody making money. Scheming. Planning. Plotting. And today, it is not like that. I can tell you. Cacheu today is very, very quiet. And there was an effort. A museum was opened there 2 years ago. I attended the opening. There are efforts to turn it into an ecotourism hub, but Cacheu is very quiet today, very, very quiet, despite the fact that it has access to the Atlantic and to the Cacheu River. So the book gives agency to Cacheu itself. 400 years ago, how this backwater in present-day Guinea-Bissau, this backwater settlement was able to make millionaires in Portugal, and other places. But today, I think it's different. I mean, I don't think today Cacheu can make, millionaires. So in as much as the book gives agency to Perez, an African woman, it also gives agency to an African settlement. How some of these, African port towns, in the Gambia, we call them tenders, like Bintang, like Albreda, all along the river Gambia, we are able to contribute, to global commerce, global, profit, global loss, and also global, interaction, economic interaction, which today, it's not the case. To close on this, I just want to say that, Prof. Toby, I think this is the best book so far. Even better than, Fistful, Fistful of Cowries, which I thought was the best of your books. But I am going apostate on this. I think this is the best, and keep it up, particularly for giving agency to a very, very small, African, settlement, 400 years ago. I hope the policy planners in Guinea-Bissau, will be able to read this book, so so that after the elections in November, they will be able to put more attention, to give more attention to Cacheu, to bring it back to its, glorious past as a center of commerce, of business, and of course of plots. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And Robin, now it's your turn.
Okay, that was a very interesting exchange. Thank you all for sharing. So the considerations that I have for this section may seem a bit redundant, but given Professor Falola's questions, I think I'll keep the redundant sections in. So in Green's book, he gives us an extraordinary lens into the making of the early modern Atlantic world through the life of one woman, Crispina Perez. Set in the 17th century, Cacheu is now what we know as Guinea-Bissau, or a city within it. The book reconstructs how Perez, a Luso African trader and Christian convert, navigated a world defined by faith, commerce, and empire. Green's narrative reminds us that the history of slavery in West Africa cannot be separated from the history of women, nor from the competing moral systems that shape their lives. Perez was born to a Portuguese father and an African mother. She lived in a town that stood at the intersection of African and Atlantic worlds, a town where Portuguese settlers, African rulers, and Creole traders negotiated every exchange of goods, power, and belief. In this setting, Perez became both indispensable and dangerous. She was a merchant, a healer, and a mediator. She was also a woman whose authorities unsettled the hierarchies of both African patriarchy and Portuguese colonialism. When the Inquisition finally reached Cacheu, Perez was accused of what we would call witchcraft and heresy. Her crime, as Green shows, was not a question of faith alone. It was a question of control over women's spiritual power, over African knowledge, and over the porous boundaries between Christianity and indigenous belief. The charges against her revealed what Green calls the spiritual fault lines of empire. This is important. In the courtroom of the Inquisition, the languages of religion and law became instruments of empire, but they also exposed its anxiety. Perez's ability to move between cosmologies, to invoke both saints and spirits, demonstrated that Africans were not simply receivers of European ideas. They were interpreters, translators, and innovators with the moral economy that Europe could neither fully understand nor dominate. By following Perez's through these archives, Green reframes how we think about global Africa, women, and slavery. Her story makes visible the gendered foundations of globalization, how women's labor and belief structured the Atlantic world. In Perez's Cacheu, the trade in captives, the practice of Christianity, and the policing of morality were all intertwined. The Inquisition's campaign to suppress her faith mirrored the broader imperial effort to discipline African autonomy and to sanctify the violence of enslavement. Another important intervention is that Green asks us to look beyond the usual categories we use to describe this period: slave, free, Christian, pagan. In Cacheu, those identities blurred constantly. Women like Perez lived in the in-between, baptized yet condemned, powerful yet vulnerable, essential yet expendable. It was precisely in the in-between space that the modern Atlantic world took shape. Ultimately, the Heretic of Cacheu is not only a microhistory of one remarkable woman, it is a meditation on the moral contradictions that created our global present. This answers the question of why this book is important. Green's work reminds us that slavery was never only an economic system. It was a contest over meaning, over whose humanity counted, whose voice defined virtue, and whose knowledge could survive empire. Crispina Perez's story shows that African women stood at the center of those struggles. They were not merely victims of a global history, they were its authors. And in remembering her life, we are reminded that the origins of the modern world and the persistence of its inequalities cannot be told without them. Thank you.
I'm sorry for this interruption. A question came from the office of the president, Madagascar, saying that their former president, Andry Rajoelina, suffered the same fate as this woman. Now, the only difference is that they couldn't do a trial of Andry because in 2020, he was accused of promoting COVID organics. I'm reading, so you have to forgive me. A herbal tonic, and he was accused of misleading the world. And they said, suppose this was in the 17th century, the president of Madagascar will have suffered an inquisition. Any of you can respond to it. Yes, Toby, go ahead.
Thank you, Prof. Yeah, I mean, and in fact, the book does look at this. So one of the last chapter is about healing, and in fact, as Robin, as you just said, we know one of the really core arguments of the book is around African knowledge and how Portuguese imperialism, European imperialism, in many ways, in terms of an African experience, one of the most fundamental aspects was its attack on African knowledge systems and who had the authority to be a healer, to prescribe a cure. And as many people, and as many people on this call know, I've also been working on the history of COVID-19, and you know, as the Office of the Madagascan President said, you know, that similar frameworks certainly came into play when it came to an imperial framework to medicine in the last few years. So I don't disagree with that intervention.
Thank you all. And right now, then we can open to the audience. If you have any questions, you can raise your hands. If you know how to do it, then you click on somewhere on Zoom here, and then, okay, we have already one. Then Chigozi, you can just, sorry for calling you by your first name, just go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Falola. Thank you, Professor Green, and all the names we have been reading and hearing. Is wonderful having you talk to us and enlighten us the more. Yeah, actually, I'm a church historian, and one of the things I'm happy about.
Where are you calling from?
Oh, I'm calling from Nigeria. I'm calling from Nigeria, Imo State, southeastern Nigeria.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. I'm really delighted because there is a work I'm doing right now that this information has actually given, this book has given me an information. But my question is this, because I know it's not easy for us here. I have just Googled the cost of the book, but the cost may not be the problem. By the time we begin to ship it down to Nigeria here, you find out that as an early career researcher, it's not easy for me, and I know for some other people. Is it possible, I'm now talking direct to the publisher, to the author, how to maybe agree with the publisher if there could be a link or a distribution center down here in Africa, West Africa, East Africa, or wherever, so that it will be easier for us. Personally, I want to buy. But by the time I pay the $35 and you put together the cost of shipping it down to this place, it may not be easy. It should be in the area of $50 or even $100, which may not be easy. My question is it possible to negotiate with the publishers for them to have maybe a distribution center across these countries within Africa or West Africa or thereabout, so that it will be easy to have this, because a book that is worth reading for enlightenment, and it cuts across so many things: religion, history, culture, what happened then, and so many things. Is really enlightening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Answer. Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Toby.
Yeah, actually, in fact, a book I've written is about to be published by Malthouse Publishers in Lagos. So I'm going to look into this and see if I can arrange for that. I will also discuss how electronic versions might be more easily available in the continent. So I will communicate through Toyin. I can communicate maybe with you on that, and or maybe or anyway, I will make sure that this is not something I've often published. I've had African publishers of my work, so I will try and ensure that can happen.
Thank you. You have here Dr. Reginald. It's nice to see you. Even if I don't see your face, I see your name. Go ahead, please, and ask your question. Can you unmute yourself? Okay, I'm not able to unmute you. Okay, here we go.
Thank you very much. My name is Reginald. I'm calling from Canada, Edmonton, precisely. Thank you, Prof, for the elaborate expose you've given on this book. I'm so impressed. And I really want to ask if there's any section in the book that's talking about maybe reparation for slavery, and especially in the context of women, based on the nature of the book. Thank you.
Toby, you can answer.
Okay, thank you. Yes, well, my previous book dealt more with this, actually. So A Fistful of Shells was a book which looked at the rise of economic inequality in this period of history and its connection to current questions of debt and the enormous injustice, economic injustice, which the African continent has faced. So this book, as was discussed, is more of a micro-history and looks at really many of the same themes, but through the lens of this one woman and the town and what was happening in this space. So it's focused on the 17th century, but as the panel discussed earlier in response to the question from Mozambique, yes, I mean, it's there to provide evidence which can then feed into that. But it's not the specific focus of the book, but those questions of economic questions are more the focus of my previous book.
Okay, thank you so much. Mateus Pereira, please go ahead. You are the next. Oh, no, Mateus is not the next. The next is Temitope. Please go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Can I be heard? Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
Great.
Where are you calling from?
Yeah, I'm calling from Germany. I want to firstly thank Professor Toyin Falola for gathering us once more. And I also want to thank the panelists. I want to thank the author, and I want to congratulate the author for this interesting publication. I would like to say that this book is very, very, much necessary as at this material point in time, because for some of us, we have always said that there's a necessity for the role of women, during the Atlantic slavery to be depicted. However, I think that it is also important to stress that considering the nature and character of the life experiences that Crispina had, it is important to stress that her involvement in African spirituality, and also the fact that it actually contradicted with the demands of the colonial state, also expressed, of the Portuguese colonial state, is an expression of the fact that women in traditional African society played an important role, within the ambit of spirituality. And if there is anything that needed to be stressed, is that aspect, of how women indeed, played, not just peripheral roles. Women played central roles within the ambit of African spirituality. Because when you examine Candobele, when you examine Santarai, when you examine Voodoo, for an instance, you would see, the great role at which women, play in respect to all these spiritual forms. So for me, it is a furtherance of the explanation of the role of women within the ambit of spirituality. And I also want to say that for us to make women visible in the historiography of Atlantic slavery, it is important for us to begin to look at the materiality of the labor of women. More often than not, we reduce the role of women to quote and unquote domestication, domestic roles. The usage of the word domestic itself trivializes the role of women. It reduces that materiality, that the role of women, was involved in the era of the Atlantic slavery, because there's something that we must begin to call on, what we call the household economy, So all of this perspective we must begin to redefine this, perspective for better understanding. The materiality of the labor of women during the Atlantic slavery must be stressed. And also the question of the reproductive, role that women played, during the Atlantic slavery. For us to begin to demand for that visibility, we must begin to look at this aspect, the question of materiality, the question of the reproductive labor, that role itself is very, very important, in the Americas. Lastly, I think the question that was asked on the relationship between the experiences of Crispina and the question of Jammeh, the president of Gambia, we cannot also trivialize that question. It is an important question, and it is an important question because we must begin to use our past, experiences in analyzing what we are experiencing today. We must begin to bring our present, within the context of past, experiences, in the sense that what we must share within this context is the question of class analysis. Of course, Crispina was involved in the Atlantic slavery, partially, but again, it must be stressed that she is just one of several other experiences in the sense of the collaborators, the African collaborators in the Atlantic slavery. But we must also say this, that in identifying the African collaborators in the Atlantic slavery, we are, not using this as an emblem, to excuse the enormity of the criminality of the Atlantic slavery. It is important to state that, because while we can today, point to the remains, to the outcomes of those that enslaved the African people, the leftovers, the remains of the wealth that they accumulated, we cannot do the same thing, to the African collaborators. Because in actual fact, their involvement, had limitations, to the point that the actual capital, that was accrued from the Atlantic slavery, a greater chunk of this wealth resides in the Atlantic. resides in the Americas, resides in Europe. So whenever we, have this concrete discussion about the role of the African collaborators, we must clearly state that, lo and behold, the ultimate capital, the ultimate capital that was acquired from the Atlantic slavery, do not reside in any part of the African continent. Thank you very much.
And a question came along that line, which Toby can take together, that are you using the Inquisition to justify slavery and the slave trade? That this was also a bad woman?
The short answer would be no. I think no. There's nothing like that. I mean, the Inquisition is an imperial institution of one of the most powerful empires at the time. It's therefore representative of imperial power. Now, I think the previous speaker connects, as you said, Prof, to this, because it's a class-based analysis is quite fundamental. Yes, she is a powerful woman. She is a wealthy woman. So it is not a question of justifying. It is a question of understanding why she was targeted by the Inquisition, because she was a wealthy woman, because African wealth was a threat to empire. And that also speaks to what the previous speaker said, that in the end, that those imperial institutions challenged that power as well. And that's one of the reasons for what was described previously, that in fact, although in a class-based analysis, such as Walter Rodney proposed, in fact, 50 years ago.
Let me challenge you more.
Okay.
Are you linking that juju, in quote, practice to resistance? Because practice,
yes. I mean, yes, because
practices have so many forms.
Yeah. African religions were certainly a form of resistance. We know that from the Americas as well. And African religions, forms of knowledge, fundamentally, forms of spirituality. Some of you know that, one of my first books was actually about what, you were called Toyin Juju, or let's call it spirituality. And, it's something I've always been interested in West Africa. And I fundamentally do believe it to, it's an alternative form of knowledge, alternative form of healing, and clearly, therefore, a challenge to imperial power. And that's, one of the key, as was also said by the previous speaker, that's, of course, one of the reasons why this woman was tried, because she was embodying all of that.
So your colleague in Gambia are not happy with you. So they said your answer on Jamel is unsatisfactory. Can you unmute him? Technical people, can you let him talk?
Is that Hassoum, or Hassoum is talking? Or I think it's for Hassoum.
Yes.
Yes, I think they unmuted me, so I'm going to mute myself.
They say they're not happy with you, with your answer.
Yes, I want to give another answer to that question. I think they are right. Yes, I was taking it from the angle of Christina Perez and her role in commerce and slavery. But when it comes to African healing, I think there's a lot of similarity with Yaya Jammeh. In fact, in the early 2000s, he defied the war, and Professor Toyin, you're talking about resistance. I work under him, as his press officer, and he didn't tell me this directly in those days, 2006 and 7, when he rolled out an AIDS, therapy program, but it was part of his, resistance, to the Western world, which, morphed into, sort of a dictatorship. He, would tell them, they say nobody can cure this disease, but it's not true. There is nothing that the Africans, cannot cure, cannot heal. And for 4 years, he was, highly involved in the AIDS therapy. Of course, he got a lot of, bashing, for that, from the mainstream, medical, establishment, So I think, there is a lot of similarity. There's a lot of, things to compare, between Christina, suffering, Inquisition, for believing in the African ways, in the African means, and Jammeh also, believing that, through the herbs, the leaves, and the prayers, AIDS can be, cured. Thank you.
Anna. So I was able to unmute myself. Yeah, I cannot unmute myself alone. Then now I was unmuted. Then let's see, Abib Badissa. Please go ahead and ask your question, Abib.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I don't know if I'm audible.
You are. Where are you calling from?
Yeah, I'm calling from Nigeria, Ogun State to be precise. Yeah, so my question, I want to thank the panelists and Professor Toyin Falola for hosting this beautiful conversation. But my question as a student, I have seen different conversations around this, but I would like to ask a question pertaining to the book by how does this book help in pushing the mantra by Pan-Africanist scholars about decolonization of African knowledge? For example, the woman that was pinpointed in the book, you spoke about they attaching what she was doing as witchcraft, which our prof mentioned earlier, and some of these things are what Pan-Africanists are trying to correct in the notion of how people from the outside or even Africans themselves see their traditional knowledge and understandings of things that were being done in the past. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we have the next one, Wowosu. Sorry if I am not pronouncing your name correctly. Please go ahead. Tell us from where you are speaking from.
I am speaking from Edmonton in Canada.
Oh, wonderful.
And the name is Owusu. You nearly got it. Yes, Mary Owusu.
Mary. Okay, that M is Mary. Mary then. Mary Owusu. Okay, great.
So I wanted to kind of piggyback on what Professor Candido said about women being everywhere in the archives, but the methods that historians use and the choices that historians make leave them out. So this is my question for Toby. Do you present, how does the archive shape the story that you tell here? And do you present a full picture? I'm asking this based on Afua Cooper's work. It's a short article, about 10 pages, Deluded and Ruined, Diana Bastian. It tells the story of what the archives gives it. And then there is Saidiya Hartman, who invents critical fabulation in Venus in Two Acts. And all these writers use what the archives gives them, the limitations of the archives to shape what they write. I'm interested if these archives that you use gave you a full picture, or do you leave us abrupt like Cooper had to do, like Hartman had to do in their works? Thank you.
Go ahead, Toby. Okay, you are unmuted, I think. Try to unmute yourself. I am not able to unmute you. I don't have that power.
Yeah, I think you can hear me now. Yeah, thanks very much for the question, Mary, and for the previous question as well. I will take the. Well, maybe it's not for me to say how full a picture the book offers. I think for the 17th, so I haven't used a critical fabulation approach. I think that's the first thing to say. I have tried to be guided by the archival materials, but I would add, in conjunction with, coming back to the previous discussion actually around orality, these are written documents, but they are, as you said, Hassoum, they are very influenced by orality, and orality is very present in the way, in the stories which are told. and as you also as Hassoum said, I've done a lot of work in oral history archives, so that influences the way in which I read the archive and in which I therefore have told the story. So it is based on written sources, but there is a lot of orality in that, and orality, of course, is a way of fabulation too. So in a way, you could say there's a fabulation based in the archive, and whether it's how complete it is, I don't think that's for me to say. But I did my best.
Were you drawing inferences? Were you doing conjectures? That's the way.
There are some conjectures, like it could have been this or it could have been that. Yeah, there's some of that. Some things we don't know for certain, and that's always the way. But the conjectures are based on what is in the text, but also, the broader, as people in the panel know, I
think I'm trying to understand the professor from Canada.
Yeah.
The way I understood our questions is issues around silences, issues around how the archive has also manipulated you. That's the way I was trying to process our question.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, obviously, the archive. There are many silences in the archive, as we all know, and the records I've used for this book contain those silences too, and that's inevitable. And particularly going back to the previous.
Will you describe as representational?
The book?
No, your character, Crispina, was she representative?
I think she was representative of her class. She was representative of the class of Naras. So that's an important point. But as I've also said, and as has been discussed, there are other sources using the book. So I'm not just using this particular trial. I do use that trial, but I use, in fact, another Inquisition trial and other records of different kinds, which do speak of people of other classes. So it's important to understand that the book does look at both. But obviously more at Crispina Perez, because she is the dominant figure in the source that I have. So I mean, coming back to the question of fabulation, I think the fabulation which is there is probably in the genre of storytelling which does feed into the documents. And then coming back to the previous question about decolonization and how the book helps to the Pan-African quest to decolonize knowledge about Africa. I think the fundamental question is the one that has been discussed around healing, medicine, and knowledge, and the way in which this this trial represents almost like is symbolic of the contest which was there, and contains a lot of evidence, as José said earlier, actually, of the kinds of healing practices and religious practices which were going on, the role of women in them, and how many of those have continued for a long time also in Guinea.
Thank you. Now we have another question from Makai Daniel. Please go ahead and mute yourself. I hope you can do it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'd like to appreciate my boss, Professor Falola, and I can see Professor Ana and Professor Maria Candido. My question is in the light of these rich discussions.
Where are you calling from?
I am calling from Nigeria. Taraba State, to be precise. In the light of the rich and diverse sources explored in this panel, my question is: how can we better center West African women as historical agents in the Atlantic world, particularly when many of these sources were produced within patriarchal and colonial frameworks? And what methodologies, excuse me, do you find most effective for uncovering for recovering women's roles, not just as victims, but as traders, as healers, and as cultural intermediaries in this history?
Go ahead, Toby, if you can unmute yourself.
Well, I'm not sure. I think I've made my effort. My methodological approach is in the book, and I think we all have different approaches to historians. I'd be interested to hear what other people think about that, on the panel. Yeah.
Jose, you want to answer that?
If he can unmute himself.
Yeah, we set up all these practices because of Zoom bombers.
No, yeah, no, I know.
Yeah.
I am not muting myself because of that. Like this, I can.
We make it difficult to bomb us.
Yeah, I want to come in there before Professor does so. I think one way is to really go deeper into the archives. Like Professor Mariana said, it is there. I mean, women are there. I mean, they are in the archives. You know, they are in the folios. You know, so it's just for us to, you know, put in more effort and more attention to women. And two is also, you know, the orality. You know, like I said, in West Africa, you know, in Senegambia, you know, the griot. Yes, that's important. You know, the language, you know, the proverbs, you know, the folklore, all of them, you know, can be very, very important sources, you know, for us, you know, to help us situate women better in the flow of African history. I mean, objects like museums, very, you know, can also say a lot, you know, about women and their role in history. Yeah. So the more we look, the more we will find. Thank you.
And I just want to add that one of the in one of the questions there was this issue of materiality, and I think that the book does a great job in that as well, in revealing this material world of Cacheu and even the household of Crispina Pérez, and what people did, how they did, which materials they used, the meanings they gave to the things they created. So this, I think, that is another dimension that Toby perhaps does not recognize that he does in his work, did already in the previous book, but this book is one that he does this as well. I don't know if José wants to say something, or if you can move to the next question.
Yeah, I think, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I think in response to that question, it is very important, especially this space from which the book emerged, which is Cacheu. Cacheu today, I still have a lot of similarity of what Toby talked about in the book. This is what I was trying to say earlier, that the fears, the practice of religion is not that far away from what it's today. The Jambakus is still very much relevant in Guinea-Bissau. In most of the group composition in Guinea-Bissau, religion is very important. So when we look at sources as they're being archived in the archive, knowing the space, the context from which it has arisen, sometimes, I mean, as Professor Hassoum said, it is very important to go through oral tradition, oral literature, because that can enrich some of the gaps that perhaps is missing in terms of the archive sources. We cannot ignore that, the thinking that archive sources themselves are there complete and finished, or they are there, we can't look back. We can, because some of those practices are still very much alive in what today is within that context. The language used and the practice of it is still very much alive in the region.
From Sheikh Anta Diop University. So if this woman just trying to kill people was persecuted, what is now happening to sex workers today who are also being persecuted? Are there similarities between her and sexual workers? From Dakar.
Thank you, Toyin. I think in terms of persecution of, I mean, there are some similarities. The similarities would be, I think that, you know, she is doing something, a practice which is actually, you know, this is the normal religious practice, normal healing practice, in the town. And so she's being persecuted for something which is something which people know is something which happens. They know it's something which happens every day. And sex workers is the same. You know, we know in complex urban environments of the 21st century, this is something which happens, and it's due to questions of inequality. It's due to questions of poverty and gender inequality, all kinds of things, and yet people are criminalized for it. So I think in that sense you can see a similarity. Yes.
Thank you. Now we have Adedolapo. Please go ahead and mute yourself if you are able to do it, and ask your question, and tell us from where you are speaking from. Hello.
Hi, everyone. Am I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead and tell us from where you are speaking.
Okay, so I'm speaking from the University of Kansas, Lawrence, Kansas State. So my question, okay, let me say thank you to everyone on this space. Thank you to Professor Toyin Falola for organizing things like this. And thank you to all the speakers. That was great. I really had a nice time here. So my question was kind of related to what Professor Owusu mentioned. I think I became curious about what Professor Toby found in his research, especially what Professor Candido was mentioning about availability of women history in the archive. So I was thinking if Professor Toby experienced similar issues, if this women history or more than what you've written are actually available, then I'm also curious about if the answer is yes, like they are being available in several spaces, how do historians that are not in gender spaces or that are not looking into gender history can be more inclusive of women representations in their manuscripts?
Toby, go ahead.
Thank you. I mean, I think this is a question which everybody, I'm sure, would want to respond here. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I've written the book focused around this particular case, which directs the narrative, the analysis in that way. But as Mariana said before, women are everywhere in the archive, and I think that is probably not so. In the period I work on, the 17th century, that is going to be a bit harder to find in some ways because they tend to be. I think in Mariana, your case, maybe in the 18th and 19th centuries, the types of records you use are not so present in the 17th century in Cacheu. Most of the records which survive tend to be about imperial administration of some kind or the history of enslavement of some kind, and so it's commercial records linked to that. So it's a bit of a different documentary source base. So I was in this sense, in terms of doing, trying to write gender history, I was lucky to have the materials here that were able, that are unusual, very unusual historical sources for this period. But I think as Hassoum said before, we have to dig in different archives and the archives will often allow that kind of work. And I suppose it's really a question, as we all know as historians, of how we look at the materials and looking with that perspective and then using that to write a different kind of narrative. But I think everybody will want to answer this question.
So who wants to add?
Yes, to add to that, I believe the Bissau Carnival, which takes place in February, that alone is an archive. It's like a performative archive. I mean, the way that some of them dress is exactly, how Christina would have dressed. 400 years ago. Your hairdo, things like that. The ashobi, all of them, dressing in the same colors. So really, the archives aside, even the material, culture, I think also is one good place, where to, find, sources, to help us reconstruct, the lives of women, particularly, those who operated in an era, when, records, are quite sparse. But also, to be fair, the book at the last, paragraph of the book, we cannot know when Christina Perez, for example, died, because apparently the Inquisition records stopped when she was put into a boat, in the summer of 1688, to be deported, back to Cacheu. That's where the Inquisition record, stopped, and that's where also all what we know about her stopped. Yeah. So there also, there's it's a point to to note. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else in the panel who would like to add some comments on this question? Not yet, then you can come back later. We have Mateus Pereira. Good to see you, Mateus. Hope you can unmute yourself. Good to see you.
Hello, everyone.
Tell us from where you are speaking, because people don't know necessarily. Go ahead.
Yeah, of course. Well, my name is Mateus Pereira. I'm speaking from Portugal, but I'm a Brazilian historian teaching African history and contemporary history in Lisbon University. Well, thank you for this great debate today. And Toby, I'm very familiar with your previous book, but not with this one. And it's my, for example, it's interesting because my students from contemporary history, now in Lisbon University are the first time that are debating African history. And they're going to read your article of African capitalism. And my question is about this, how your new book debates and cross with your previous debates of this question of African capitalism, and how gender enters with these new debates of Africa and capitalism. Well, that's it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mateus. Nice to see you. And for the people who may not know, I wrote an article a few years ago on the history of Africa in capitalism, and how historians of capitalism in the West have generally not included African histories, economic histories, in the history of capitalism, and how this is very problematic in a number of ways. And so, I think what the book does in this regard is really, as Hassoum said, I think, Cacheu is itself the agency of the town, of the settlement in economic transformations. So, what the book shows and what the records that we have show, so there's no fabulation here, the records show that, there are materials from all corners of the world passing through Cacheu, from China, from Mexico, from Potosi in Bolivia, from different parts of Europe, with cloths, from India, textiles, and that there is a financial exchange taking place in Cacheu, linked to that, and linked to all of these transactions, and also to production. So textile production and trade and commerce is an important part of the business which is happening, and Senegambian production of textiles, and is monetized in Cacheu. In fact, they're one of the main currencies, in fact, in Cacheu. So it certainly does connect to all of that. And then, as mentioned before, women run the marketplace in the town. So yes, it brings a gendered lens into those questions, I think. Thank you, Mateus.
Thank you. We have now Emma. Please go ahead.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi. I just want to say thank you to all the panelists. This was very insightful. And so my question comes from really is to, since this is a microhistory, what inspired doing a book on a microhistory? And what do you want the readers to gather and take away from the book as a whole?
Toby, you are muted.
I think I'm not now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, now you are fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think what really inspired me to write, I mean, so some people know I worked previously on producing an edition of the text with two colleagues who I want to mention, Felipe Ribeiro da Silva and Philip Havik, and we produced this text about 3 or 4 years ago with the trial. But you know, it's not for most people, it's not a very readable text, and you know, historians do a lot of work beyond just, as many people know, just the text. You know, it's the context around that and the understanding that we have of that helps us to understand the text. So I wanted to turn it into something quite legible, because I understood that this is a very unusual document, which provides, I think, as hopefully the discussion has shown, you know, insights into the historical experience in this time, which is very rare. And, you know, I hope that is legible to people interested in different things, as has been said, different places, different time periods, questions today of which have been raised, you know, around economic livelihoods in urban spaces, of women, questions of knowledge and power in the 21st century, and all of those questions, and some of their historical roots, and when in this key period of the 17th century. So I suppose to answer the second part of your question, Emma, what I would like people to take away from it is understanding how that changed, how it wasn't always like that, and how this period is a period when that changed and set in train many of the processes which, as we've seen in the discussion tonight, or this morning, for those of you on the western side of the Atlantic, is still, you know, so fundamental to the world today.
Thank you. Thank you, Toby, Emma. And now I don't see any additional questions, so perhaps you can start wrapping up. Sorry. And I go back then to the panelists, perhaps starting with Mariana, to say some final remarks, that anything that you would like to add, and then Toby can close.
Well, I want to say that I hope anyone who is watching us will be curious to read this book, to learn more about this case, but also to interrogate more about the African past. It doesn't, no, your research not necessarily needs to be about Guinea-Bissau to be interested in this case. So you can, reading this book, you can learn on methods, on styles, on how to weave a history and tell a history that is appealing and accessible to a general reader. So I hope people will read this book. I also hope that anyone who is watching will do more research about the African past, particularly the most distant past. There's lots of scholarship done in recent centuries. We know we don't know as much about the 17th century or periods before the 17th century. So it's also, I think it's a plea for more research about the African past. And I hope people will feel motivated to do the research, to publish their work, and engage with the work of historians. And congratulations, Toby, for writing this book. And I'm looking forward to discussing my graduate seminar later this semester.
Thank you, Mariana. And now, Robin, I am following the order that I have here. Okay, go ahead, please.
Absolutely. Okay. As we reflect on the themes represented in this panel, we are reminded that global history is in many ways a history of Africa. It is the story of how African people, especially women, made and remade the terms of belonging, survival, faith in a global system built upon their displacement. Toby Green's The Heretic of Cacheu leaves us with an enduring question. What does it mean to live morally in a world that depends on exploitation? In 17th century Cacheu, Crispina Perez confronted that question daily. She inhabited the overlapping spaces of commerce, spirituality, and gendered power. Her persecution of the Inquisition shows how empire sought to discipline not only African labor, but the African imagination, the moral and spiritual creativity that allowed women like Perez to live fully human lives amid systems that denied their humanity. If Green's work teaches us anything, it is that slavery was not simply an episode in history, it was a world order, one that shaped the movement of people, the making of nations, and the categories through which we understand virtue and freedom. The institutions of slavery have changed form, but the structures they created persist. The devaluation of care work, the feminization of poverty, the invisibility of domestic and migrant labor, the moral hierarchies that continue to define who serves and who is served. In our current moment, when global inequities remain structured by histories of servitude and gendered labor, the lessons of these women endure. They compel us to center Africa not at the margins of world history, but at its core. To study global Africa is to see that modern capitalism, Christianity, and even our ideas of civilization were forged in dialogue with African experiences. It is to understand that what we call the global was not born in Europe, but through countless transactions, economic, emotional, and spiritual, that Africans sustained, resisted, and redefined. And it is to recognize that the history of slavery is also the history of freedom's most radical imagination. In the face of violence and coercion, African women imagined forms of freedom that were not dependent on ownership or property, but on reciprocity, dignity, and belonging. They redefined the meaning of power through motherhood, healing, spirituality, and commerce. Their life suggests that freedom is not only the absence of bondage, but the presence of relationship, the ability to choose connection to on one's own terms. That is why Crispina Perez still matters. She reminds us that moral authority does not always come from the center of power. Often it comes from the edges, from those who refuse to be fully possessed. Her story shows that the struggle for freedom has always been a struggle over meaning, over whose knowledge counts, whose labor is recognized, and whose humanity is seen. To conclude, the study of global Africa and women's history is not simply about recovering lost voices. It is about redefining the narrative of global modernity itself. When we place Africa and African women at the heart of that story, we are forced to see that we are forced to see the global not as a series of connections radiating from Europe, but as a web of interdependence in which Africans have always been central. This reframing challenges the moral geography of the modern world, the idea that progress and civilization move in one direction. If Perez stood at the crossroads of empire, then so do we. Her life urges us to confront our own complicities and to imagine new moral economies of care and justice. The world she inhabited was unequal, violent, and yet profoundly interconnected. So too is ours. The question that remains echoing across centuries is whether we will continue to live within those inherited hierarchies, or whether we will find, as she tried to do, a more humane way of being in a global world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robin. Thank you. José, final remarks.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to say to Toby, congratulations for writing the book. You put Cacheu, Guinea-Bissau into the map. But that is not only that. What this is about how we go about writing history. Professor Candido said earlier, we often tend to think about the big picture of history. But this is more like you are taking the broom to sweep the archive in detail to find out some of the details that have gone missing. So this is what this is about. It is about microhistory. For us to understand what African contribution is about, we have to return to microhistory where that engagement must be possible. But also it tells us about the sources themselves, that even if, as Professor Chapdelaine has said, within these sources, we can still find African voices that refuse to die, that refuse to accept the domination, even in Africa, because often we think that the history of resistance of the enslaved African is always in the Atlantic, as if nothing happened in Africa. No, there is a lot happening in Africa. There is a lot has happened, which has been carried to the Atlantic world and so on. So I think what the book is trying to show us is precisely that. The revolution that took place in Saint Tomé, as an example, was that example that was carried out to Palmares a century later. So precisely that, we can still find the African voices from within the archive if we are ready, provided that, we are, from already to look at much more in detail what went on in that particular context, such as the context of Cacheu.
Thank you, José. Obrigada. Then Hassoum, you can unmute yourself. Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to describe the book as an honorable tragedy. An honorable tragedy. The book, at least Crispina did not die in a foreign land. She died in Cacheu, maybe a few weeks or months after she was deported. I think that it means a lot, I mean, to the African, the African soil, she ended up where everything started. That's, on this very, very important, settlement. I want to congratulate our good friend, Professor Toby. He gives agency to Senegambia. All his works, all of them, gives agency to Senegambia. Meaning Gambia, the rivers Gambia, Senegal, Cacheu, and all the regions, in between them. For him, if you are familiar with his work, the borders as we know them today are more than artificial. They mean nothing. When he comes to the Gambia, we usually make a trip to Casamas. In few hours, back to the Gambia. I invite him, like we did with the previous book, to have a lunch in Bissau, at a later date. So, Prof, I find a date with Banjul. President Mbalo is building the road, from Pak, to Safin. I hope it will be ready in the coming months. And then we, go to Cacheu and Bissau and do a launch, of the book. I think that will be, one way of making the people of Cacheu proud of the book and proud of the role that they have played in, like in global history. Thank you very much, and congratulations to everybody. I feel very proud to be part of this eminent panel. I am familiar with I am familiar with the work of all of you. I just finished reading Professor Nafafé's book. The book on the Lorenzo de Silva. It's a very good book. Professor Ana, I've just finished reading Gifts. Professor Mariana, I have 2 of your books. And Professor Robin, the same thing. The Godfather, Professor Falola, over 7 of his books are here. He's the Godfather.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to all of you. Thank you to all of you. And
thank you.
Once again, thank you.
Thank you very much. You want to have a closing statement before I thank all of you, Anna?
Yes, Toby is the last one to speak, and after I will say bye-bye to all of you. And you can say some words as well. I allow that. So Toby, go ahead first, and
well,
then
thank you, everybody. I want to thank everybody. You know, I'm very grateful and honored to have been, you know, for you to have given thought like this to this work, which, as you all know, is, you know, we all write books, but we all work together in many different ways. And so this book wouldn't exist without any of you. So thank you, and for thinking about it. And I want to thank the Godfather, yes, Prof. Falola. Thank you very much for hosting us this evening. It has really made a massive difference to our ability to discuss the book and share it with so many people. So thank you. And thank you to everybody who has participated. And I think already I've spoken enough this evening, so I will thank everybody again. And that will be enough from me.
Thank you all. Thank you to all the panelists. It was very generous of you to take your Sunday to spend so many hours with us discussing the book. And especially thank you, Professor Falola, for providing this space for us to discuss a book, which is always something that perhaps these days is hard. And I leave to you, Professor Falola, if you want to say some words to close the meeting.
Thank you very much. We're going to play music immediately after. If you have time, you can enjoy the music. 5 minutes after we close, the entire transcript will be released to the world on YouTube. 5 minutes. So you can send them to your friends and well-wishers. The media joined, you won't see them because we only use Zoom to stream. In fact, we do not count the number who appear on Zoom as part of our audience. We just use this audience to Zoom. 19 countries joined us. We are very grateful. We cannot know what the media will say. They may say this is the worst interview they've ever seen in their life. We will never know what they are going to say. Then I do my own analysis. Those of you who have been following us, I will do my own reflections on this interview. On Wednesday, we'll have the final figure who watched, but with 878,000 have watched this program. 878,000, because they have to, the file reports to us. From these 19 countries, they will tell us the number of the audience. But the file for us, as we're talking, 878,000. The people in the Gambia, the people in Madagascar, they said they are very happy with this program. And hopefully the book will restore the credibility of their presidents that have been damaged. Whether the book will do that, I don't know. I told Anna that this is not your regular conference panel. This is not like going to the ASA. This is not a conference panel. And you could see the members of the audience are reading your conversation and your book in ways they can understand and they can connect with. And we thank the Office of the President of Madagascar for using this opportunity to seek redress, what they call injustice. Listening to all of you, what is my own takeaway, which is very temporary? Because I usually will rewatch the entire program various times. The first takeaway from the challenges of the archives is historiographical. That how do we write history? Is micro-history legitimate? If no, what is the problem? If yes, how can new scholars take to microhistory? There are issues around definition that we couldn't clarify. You will notice we slip into modernity. In slipping into issues around modernity, it's the audience that forced us actually to slip into that modernity, because they are the one comparing this with Sarah Batman, with Jamel. So, and in that comparison, they move the great relevance for the incident of 17th century. And we have to express our gratitude that they're reading a work based on the 17th century with modernist eyes. And who is defining this? Because they are stretching what the author has done, they are stretching it to 2025. Somebody asked, what is heresy? What is heresy? That they left with a lack of understanding of what heresy is. And people are impressed that the colonial archives can restore silences. Fagunwa's question, Owusu's question. Now, listen very carefully to two of the panelists. We also slip into another conversation, issues around morality. That may be good, but it may also be a very dangerous slope. In which, because once you slip into morality, and that's why the people in Gambia said they're not happy with Hassoum. Because the way they're framing their question is that they are taking us away from history to morality. That's the way I understood these questions. In my own reflection, I would say more regarding that. And who is complicit? That's a question from Madagascar. And Toby answered it in terms of imperial hegemony. That's the way I understood Toby's framing of his own answer. Because if the president of Madagascar said he's been criticized, and people are saying, why is Hassoum not praising Jamel? Why is he praising this lady who did the same thing? That now becomes, that's not an historiographical issue. That becomes a moral issue. So could we begin to see this as a moral inquiry into a phenomenon? And the way Toby is trying to put it is that Inquisition itself should be connected to hegemonic power. In other words, it's a legal document, but that legal document is moving us, as if you are discussing Lumumba, into the moral justification of death, of assassination. And I see that as important. So we have the complexity of what I call the intersection of justice, morality, and history. And that intersection is extremely powerful. Second, if you listen to Mariana very well, she's connecting her own contribution to Atlantic history. That's how I understood her contribution. And two of you, that, okay, where do we locate the center of this Atlantic history? So Toby creates a dual location, West Africa and Portugal. That's my understanding of his book. And when I read the book, there are books on port cities. Jim Sidbury of Rice did a book on port cities. So the port cities is now co-producing, as one of the panelists said, a global history. I think it's Mariana again, one of you, and Toby, in which Cacheu and Hassoum is very happy about the excavation. Like Kumbi Saleh, all the towns on the Niger Bend that we no longer talk about. So Hassoum's gratitude is about the rescue of a forgotten town, like Kumbi Saleh or Salaga or Timbuktu, famous hundreds of years ago, but now they have become deserted and less popular. I've done a series of 3 books on everyday lives for Bloomsbury, daily lives. I'm also reading this as part of the extension of daily lives. Because what is it that people are doing every day? The market, the trade, the religion, those are daily lives. And what this book does is now to interject in that daily lives imperial hegemony. So I'm already writing my reflection in which we see daily lives. In that daily lives, the book emphasizes issues around subversion very clearly. Subversion that got punished. But who is defining the subversion? It is not the local entrepreneurs that is discussing the subversion. It is a force superior to them. So we have issues around adaptation, kinship networks, local politics, all located in turbulence. Turbulence of understanding spirituality in relation to danger. So I read the book and your conversations as discussing what I will frame as a vibrant paucity in relation to the Atlantic economy, but also what Kapolanyi taught us in the 1950s when he coined the phrase moral economies. That's not my phrase. That was Kapolanyi's phrase, moral economies. So we can say, okay, now there's a lot of focus on religion. What Toby uses spirituality that you all emphasize, in which that spirituality works for the local context, in which there was no persecution. In that sense, we see how we can find similar patterns in Bahia, as in the work of Malay's rebellion, the Islam that our great colleague wrote about, in which religion itself becomes a source of fear, because you do not fully understand it. And Portugal, in the case of Brazil, remember, also persecuted Candomblé people in ways similar to how this woman is also persecuted. 17th century, we call it part of the early modern. And for those of us who teach this topic, we will be able to connect it to early modern. I'm not a member of your panel, but I'm happy that Ana Lucia has given me a little space to talk, and I'm very grateful to all of you. Go and enjoy your lunch, or go and enjoy your dinner, and I'm very happy. And on Wednesday, I will tell you the number of people who have watched this conversation. So more and more people will watch it once we post it on YouTube. I'm grateful to our technical partners. I'm grateful to our partners in different parts of the world who join us. I'm grateful for resources to pay the partners who demand compensation. We are grateful to undergraduate students, graduate students, and more importantly, we are grateful to Green, and I will change his color this afternoon to Mariana's color. From Green, what do we call Anna's color? Are you wearing pink?
I think so, yes.
So I will change Toby's name from